The dim light of the street lamps flickered as if struggling against the encroaching night. The air was damp and cool, with the scent of rain still lingering from an earlier shower. A worn-out bench at the bus stop creaked faintly under the weight of John Miller, a man whose posture spoke of exhaustion but whose eyes held the quiet strength of someone who had seen too much and survived it all. His clothes were simple: a work shirt, frayed at the edges, and a pair of jeans that bore the marks of hard labor. His boots, though scuffed and worn, were sturdy and reliable. His hands, calloused and cracked, rested lightly on his knees. These hands had once gripped weapons in far-off lands, had once saluted flags, had once signed papers releasing him from a life of military service. Now they gripped nothing but silence and solitude. John had served his country for 20 years as a Marine. He had seen battlefields most people only read about in history books. He had faced enemies with unyielding resolve, endured sleepless nights in the trenches, and watched comrades fall. The horrors of war had left their marks on his soul, invisible scars he carried with him every day. But the transition to civilian life had not been easy. The battlefield of everyday life, with its relentless grind and financial burdens, proved to be just as challenging. He worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, a mechanic by day and a janitor by night, just to support himself and his elderly mother, Rose. Despite the hardships, John never complained. He found solace in the little moments: his mother's warm smile when he returned home, the quiet evenings when they shared stories over cups of tea, and the simple satisfaction of a job well done. His life was a testament to resilience, a quiet perseverance that went unnoticed by the world around him. That night, as he sat waiting for the bus, the street around him was eerily quiet. The occasional car passed by, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. The wind whispered through the empty streets, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and the promise of another cold night. John pulled his jacket tighter around himself, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the faint glow of city lights flickered like distant stars. The peace of the night was broken by the sound of footsteps. John glanced up, his sharp instincts kicking in. A group of young men was approaching the bus stop. There were 4 of them, their laughter echoing through the empty street. They moved with the casual arrogance of youth, their voices carrying a tone of mockery and defiance. The apparent leader, a boy named Mike, walked at the front. He wore a backward baseball cap and an oversized hoodie, his eyes scanning the street with a smug confidence. Beside him were Jake, Tyler, and Rob, each exuding a different kind of youthful bravado. "Hey, look at that," Mike said loudly, his gaze locking onto John. "This guy looks like he's been through a war or something. Maybe he's been digging ditches all day, huh?" The others laughed, their voices cutting through the night like knives. John remained silent, his hands steady on his knees. He had heard taunts like this before. He knew that engaging would only escalate the situation. Instead, he focused on his breathing, keeping his gaze steady and his mind calm. "Yo, old man, can't you hear us?" Jake called out, his voice deliberately loud. "Or are you deaf? Want us to shout louder?" The laughter grew, and Tyler bent down to pick up an old soda can. He rolled it toward John, the can clattering against the pavement before coming to a stop at John's feet. John glanced at the can briefly before looking straight ahead again. His expression remained unchanged, but his mind was alert. He assessed the situation with the precision of a soldier. The boys were inexperienced, their aggression stemming more from boredom than true malice. But ignorance could be dangerous. "What's the matter, old man? Too scared to even look at us?" Mike pressed, stepping closer. He nudged the soda can with his foot, crossing his arms as he tilted his head. "What, you think you're invisible or something?" Rob snickered. "Maybe he thinks he's too good to talk to us." John said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. Silence could disarm, confuse, and sometimes even diffuse tension. But tonight, his silence seemed to fuel the boys' arrogance. They mistook it for weakness. Mike's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Oh, I get it. You think you're tough, huh? Sitting there all quiet like you're some kind of war hero or something. But you're not. You're just a tired, old man." John exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting to the faint glow of the approaching bus lights. He had no desire to escalate the situation. All he wanted was to get home to his mother. But he could feel the tension in the air thickening, like a storm gathering strength. His mind flashed back to the battlefields, to moments when calm and patience had been the difference between life and death. You think you're better than us? Jake asked, stepping forward. His tone was taunting, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. You're not. You're just like everyone else. Probably worse. Look at you, working 2 jobs and still can't afford decent clothes. Tyler and Rob snickered, their laughter echoing through the street. Mike took another step closer, his eyes locked on John's face. Come on, old man. Say something. Or are you just gonna sit there like a coward? John remained still, his mind racing through possible scenarios. He knew that standing up and confronting them would only escalate the situation. He also knew that showing fear would embolden them. So he sat, calm and composed, waiting for the right moment. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension. Enough. A young woman stepped out from the shadows, her voice firm and unwavering. She was in her mid-20s, with sharp eyes that held a fierce determination. Her presence was unexpected, and it momentarily stunned the boys. What are you doing? She demanded, her gaze sweeping over the group. Harassing a man who's just trying to get home. You think that makes you tough? Mike faltered, his confidence wavering. We were just having some fun, he mumbled, his tone defensive. Fun, the woman repeated, her voice rising. You call this fun? Mocking someone who's done more for this country than you can even imagine. Do you even know who he is? The boys exchanged uneasy glances. The woman stepped closer, her gaze fixed on Mike. That man served in the Marines. He put his life on the line so that you can have the freedom to walk these streets without fear. And this is how you repay him. John watched in silence, a hint of gratitude flickering in his eyes. The woman's words hit their mark. The boys shifted uncomfortably, their bravado crumbling under the weight of her words. You think you're brave, she continued. Bravery isn't about picking on someone who won't fight back. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. It's about respect. And right now, you're showing none of it. The street fell silent, the boys' laughter replaced by shame. Mike looked down, his face flushing with embarrassment. Jake muttered something under his breath, but it was lost in the stillness. The woman turned to John, her expression softening. Sir, are you all right? John nodded slowly. I'm fine. Thank you. The bus arrived, its headlights cutting through the mist. The boys shuffled away, their heads down, their laughter silenced. The woman waited until they were out of sight before turning back to John. Thank you, John said quietly. For stepping in. She smiled. It's the least I could do. People like you deserve respect. Not ridicule. John boarded the bus, his mind heavy with thoughts. As the bus pulled away, he glanced out the window, watching the woman fade into the distance. Her courage had been a beacon in the dark, a reminder that there was still good in the world. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Misjudgment, but this wasn't a battlefield. This was Kansas City, a peaceful night he didn't want to see descend into chaos. Mike stepped closer, his face nearly invading John's space. So, what are you going to do, huh? Sit there all night? Mike sneered, his voice trembling with suppressed frustration. Finally, John's gaze shifted, slowly and deliberately. He looked directly into Mike's eyes. It wasn't a glare filled with anger or hatred, but a steady, unwavering stare that carried neither fear nor submission. It was the look of a man evaluating a passing breeze. Mike hesitated for a split second. Something in John's eyes unsettled him, but the moment of doubt was fleeting, quickly drowned out by the laughter and goading of his friends behind him. For someone like Mike, proving his strength in front of his peers outweighed reason. Meanwhile, John continued assessing the situation, weighing every possibility. Deep down, he still hoped the group would tire of their antics and move on, but their behavior suggested otherwise, and his instincts warned him that silence alone might not be enough to dissuade them. The night wind whispered through the air, carrying a faint chill that added to the tension in the atmosphere. Mike stood motionless, his eyes fixed intently on John as if waiting for a reaction, any reaction. But John remained silent, his face betraying nothing but an impenetrable calm. The way he sat there, unflinching under the provocation, only served to irritate Mike further. From a distance, the sound of high heels echoed, mingling with the rowdy laughter of the group. A young woman, likely in her early 20s, approached the bus stop at a brisk pace. Emily, dressed in a snug beige coat and carrying a small handbag over her shoulder, seemed to be hurrying home. She glanced at the group of youths but quickened her steps deliberately, hoping to avoid their notice. "Hey there, sweetheart," Jake called out suddenly, his tone dripping with provocation. "Where are you rushing off to? We're waiting for the bus too. Why not stick around and chat a bit?" Emily ignored him, keeping her gaze fixed ahead, though her slightly faltering steps betrayed the composed facade she tried to maintain. She lowered her head and walked faster, but her haste only amused the group more. "Didn't you hear us? We're being polite here," Rob chimed in, his voice a mix of mockery and menace. He tossed a candy wrapper onto the ground, startling Emily but failing to halt her progress. From his seat, John quietly observed the scene, his brows furrowed slightly at the sight of Emily being harassed, but he remained silent. He understood individuals like Mike and his crew. They weren't looking for conversation. They were seeking attention, any form of it, enough to feel a semblance of control. Intervening now would only feed their satisfaction. As Emily passed by John, her eyes briefly met his. It was as though she recognized something different in this man, a presence that contrasted sharply with the aggressiveness of the youths. Amid her fear, there was a strange, almost reassuring calmness about him. "Thank you," Emily murmured as she walked past, perhaps acknowledging the quiet steadiness John displayed amidst the chaos. It was a small gesture, a fleeting note of gratitude for his composed presence, an anchor in a turbulent moment. John gave a faint nod, a gesture full of meaning. It wasn't complicity but rather an assurance that, at least from his end, things were under control. But that small act didn't escape Mike's notice. "What's this? You two know each other?" he sneered, his voice loud and mocking for everyone to hear. "As the old man playing bodyguard for you, sweetheart. Does she think he's going to protect her?" Tyler added, his voice sharp and biting. "Look at him. He hasn't even said a word to us." Emily didn't respond. She lowered her head further and hurried away from the bus stop, yet her brief presence left a smoldering ember in the group. Being ignored by both John and Emily stung their pride. Mike took another step toward John, narrowing his eyes. "So, what's your deal, old man? You think sitting there, saying nothing, makes everything okay?" His voice dropped, laden with an undercurrent of menace. "I think you're looking down on us." Jake, Tyler, and Rob closed in behind him, forming a loose circle as though ready to escalate at any moment. Their mocking laughter had faded, replaced by a stifling tension. John remained silent, though his hands shifted slightly, gripping the straps of his backpack. He understood the situation clearly. These young men were fishing for a reaction, and in the absence of one, they were bound to push further. He drew a deep breath, not out of fear but to maintain his composure. His mind drifted to memories of the battlefield, moments when enemies would deliberately test his patience, scenarios where restraint proved to be his most vital weapon. But this wasn't a war zone, and the adversaries in front of him weren't soldiers. They were kids driven by misplaced bravado and a touch of envy. Even so, John knew all too well that one misstep could send the situation spiraling out of control. The screech of bus brakes shattered the tense atmosphere. Headlights illuminated the bus stop, casting a glow on the scene. John didn't move. The group of youths also paused, their gazes shifting uncertainly toward the vehicle, unsure how their game would proceed if John boarded the bus. Slowly, John stood, his backpack heavy on his shoulders. He approached the bus door, but instead of stepping inside as he usually would, he glanced briefly at the driver and shook his head. "I'll walk," he muttered softly, his voice meant only for himself. He had no intention of confining himself to a small, enclosed space with these young men. Walking home would allow him to distance himself without confrontation. As the bus pulled away, leaving a faint trail of exhaust in the air, John began to walk, his hands loose at his sides, his demeanor calm and measured. He didn't need to look back to know the snickers and shuffling footsteps behind him were following. The group wasn't ready to let him go so easily. "Old man wants to walk home, huh?" Mike's voice rang out behind him, dripping with mockery. "Maybe he thinks a shortcut will make us give up." Jake and Rob's laughter followed, egging on their leader. John didn't turn around. His footsteps remained steady, his gaze fixed forward, but he could feel their presence creeping closer as though they needed to exert their control over the space. An empty soda can suddenly rolled across the pavement, bumping into John's heel. Next came a plastic container, clattering noisily as it hit the ground. "Watch out, old man," Tyler yelled, feigning concern. "Don't trip over our mess." John stayed silent, though his shoulders tensed instinctively. He didn't want to escalate things, but his restraint had its limits. Every step he took now was deliberate, his mind alert to every possibility. He knew their goal was to provoke him into reacting, and if that happened, there would be no turning back. Reaching an intersection, John paused briefly. Ahead lay the main road, illuminated by street lights and occasionally traversed by passing cars. But he chose to turn right into a narrow alley where the path was darker and less frequented. He reasoned that if the worst came to pass, he would rather it happened somewhere isolated where no one else could get involved. The group followed closely. "Look at that. He's going into an alley," Mike jeered, his voice filled with excitement. "Guess he's scared enough to run and hide." The alley was desolate, flanked by tall brick walls covered in graffiti. Metal trash bins lined the path, some tipped over, spilling garbage onto the ground. Dim neon lights overhead cast fragmented shadows that stretched ominously across the wet pavement. John slowed his pace, not out of fear but to ensure he maintained control of the situation. The sound of the group's footsteps grew louder, their presence closer than ever. "You think going in here is going to scare us?" Mike called out, stepping ahead of his friends. "You're making this feel like an action movie." Jake and Tyler erupted into laughter, their voices echoing off the walls. The laughter echoed harshly through the narrow alley, amplified by the wet, reflective surfaces of the brick walls. It was a cruel sound, mingling with the steady rhythm of rain that drummed against the pavement. Rob picked up a glass bottle from a nearby trash pile, tossing it into the air with a practiced flick of his wrist, catching it again with a grin that was all malice. The rain slicked his hair to his forehead, but he didn't seem to care. "So what now, old man?" Rob's voice was mocking, dripping with contempt. He tossed the bottle up once more, letting it spin lazily in the air before catching it again. "Are you going to call the cops? Or maybe just start running?" John continued walking, his steps steady despite the uneven, rain-slick pavement. His boots splashed through shallow puddles, the sound a steady counterpoint to the jeers behind him. He said nothing, his silence like a shield against their taunts. But then, he stopped. Without warning, he halted in the middle of the alley, his back to the group. The sudden cessation of his footsteps left an eerie silence in its wake, broken only by the patter of rain. The air seemed to grow heavier, charged with unspoken tension. The group's laughter faltered, the sound dying awkwardly in their throats. John didn't turn around right away. He stood still for a moment, as though weighing his next move carefully. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached down and set his backpack on the ground. His movements were unhurried, purposeful. There was no trace of fear in his actions, only an air of quiet resolve. The group of young men exchanged glances, their bravado dimming in the face of John's unexpected calm. Mike, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, took a step forward, trying to regain control of the situation. His smirk wavered slightly, but he forced it back into place. "Oh, so now you're going to stand there and stare at us?" Mike sneered, his voice laced with nervous energy. "What's this? Trying to scare us with your silence?" Finally, John turned. His gaze met Mike's, steady and unwavering. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to see straight through the bravado, peeling back the layers of false confidence to the insecurity beneath. There was no malice in John's stare, only a quiet strength that spoke of experience and patience. Mike took another step forward, but his movements were more cautious now. "What's your deal, old man? You think you're better than us?" "Too good to say anything." John said nothing. He simply stood there, rain dripping from the brim of his hood, his posture relaxed but alert. His silence wasn't a refusal to engage, it was a choice, a deliberate act of defiance in the face of provocation. "Say something." Tyler, one of Mike's friends, shouted, his voice cracking slightly with frustration. "Or are you just gonna stand there all night?" The rain continued to fall, heavier now, soaking through clothes and plastering hair to heads. Lightning flickered in the distance, briefly illuminating the scene in stark relief. In that flash of light, John's figure stood out against the darkness, tall, imposing, and utterly unyielding. Rob, still holding the glass bottle, fidgeted nervously. He tossed the bottle up again, but this time his grip slipped. The bottle tumbled to the ground, shattering on the pavement with a sharp, brittle sound that echoed through the alley. The crash seemed to break the spell. Mike's smirk faded completely, replaced by a frown of irritation. "What's your problem, huh?" he demanded, his voice harsher now. "Think you can just ignore us? You're not better than us." John's gaze never wavered. His silence was more effective than any words could have been. It unsettled them, made them question themselves. They had expected fear, anger, or pleading, anything but this impenetrable calm. Behind them, the sound of approaching footsteps cut through the rain. A figure appeared at the mouth of the alley, moving swiftly despite the weather. It was Emily, the young woman who had passed by the bus stop earlier. Her beige coat was darkened with rain, and her hair clung to her face, but there was a determined set to her jaw. "What's going on here?" Emily's voice rang out, clear and sharp. The group turned, surprised by her sudden appearance. Mike's scowl deepened. "Nothing that concerns you," he snapped. "Keep walking." Emily didn't back down. She stepped closer, her gaze flickering between John and the group of young men. "It sure looks like it concerns me," she said. "Why don't you leave him alone?" Mike laughed, though it sounded forced. "What? You his guardian angel now?" John finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Go home, Emily." She hesitated, glancing at him. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "Go home. I've got this." Reluctantly, Emily took a step back. "Be careful," she murmured before turning and walking away. Mike watched her go, his expression darkening. "You think you're a tough guy, huh?" he said, turning back to John. "Think you can just stand there and stare us down? We're not afraid of you." John took a step forward, closing the distance between them. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving Mike's. "I don't need you to be afraid," John said quietly. "I need you to listen." The group shifted uneasily, exchanging uncertain glances. John's calm demeanor was throwing them off balance, making them question their actions. "This isn't a game," John continued. "And it's not going to end the way you think." Mike clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "You don't scare me." "I'm not trying to scare you," John replied. "I'm trying to stop you from making a mistake." For a long moment, silence hung between them. The rain continued to pour, soaking them all to the bone. Then, slowly, Mike stepped back. "Let's go," he muttered to his friends. "This isn't worth it." One by one, the group followed his lead, retreating down the alley. Rob glanced back once, his expression conflicted, before disappearing into the night. John watched them go, his posture relaxing only when they were out of sight. He picked up his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder, and began walking again, his footsteps steady against the rain-slick pavement. From the shadows, Emily reappeared, stepping out from where she had been watching. "You okay?" she asked softly. John nodded. "Yeah, I'm okay." They walked in silence for a while, the rain continuing to fall around them. Finally, Emily spoke again. "Thank you," she said, "for standing up to them." John glanced at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "Sometimes," he said, "all it takes is standing your ground." John's lesson was deeply ingrained. True strength isn't found in immediate reactions but in restraint and the ability to choose the right moment. The rain falling around him in the present brought him back to the dim alley. He blinked, shaking off the weight of the memory. That battle was long over, but its lessons remained vivid as ever. Patience, focus, and keeping a clear head under pressure, these qualities had saved him and his comrades countless times. And now, amidst the cold rain and mounting tension, he knew he had to rely on them once more. Mike took a deep breath and stepped closer again, his wet sneakers splashing in the puddles forming around him. "Who do you think you are? Standing there like you're some kind of hero?" he barked, though his voice carried less conviction than before. John's gaze didn't waver. It wasn't contempt he held for Mike and his friends, it was understanding. He saw in them echoes of the young soldiers he had once led, men who masked their fear with bravado and recklessness. They, too, had stood on the precipice of danger, not realizing how close they were to falling. John had guided them back then, and now he would do the same if he could. You don't know what you're doing, John said evenly, his voice clear and calm through the rain. It wasn't a challenge. It was a warning. The group fell silent for a moment. Mike narrowed his eyes, trying to decipher the look in John's, but all he found was unshakable composure, something he had never encountered before. It unsettled him more than any shout or strike could have. Let it go, Mike, Tyler muttered, his tone lacking the enthusiasm it had before. Maybe we should just let him go. No, Mike snapped, spinning to glare at Tyler. He couldn't afford to lose face now, not with his friends watching. He needed to prove something, though deep down, he was starting to realize he had miscalculated. John exhaled silently, measuring every breath. He didn't want to fight, but he knew some lessons were only learned at the edge of failure. If that edge came tonight, he would be ready, not to harm, but to ensure things didn't spiral beyond control. A distant rumble of thunder echoed through the alley's brick walls, a low warning that blended with the heavy rain now drenching the narrow passage. The downpour intensified, the relentless droplets bouncing off the grimy pavement and creating streams of water that trickled through every crevice. John stood motionless, his shoulders squared, rain cascading down his jacket and pooling around the backpack on the ground near his feet. He pulled his hood up slightly to shield himself from the cold rain, but his sharp eyes remained fixed on Mike and his group, unwavering and unyielding. The relentless rain seemed only to embolden Mike, who stood still for a moment, his gaze darting between John and his friends as though seeking their approval. The silence from his companions and John's composed, almost indifferent demeanor seemed to strike at his pride. Between them, the air grew taut, charged with tension that threatened to snap. Enough, Mike muttered, his voice low but edged with determination. Old man, if you won't show us how tough you are, I'll have to teach you otherwise. Before John could respond, Mike lunged forward, shoving him hard on the shoulder. It wasn't a strike meant to hurt but a challenge, a gesture meant to assert dominance. John, unsurprised, stepped back slightly to regain his balance, his hands instinctively rising into a neutral, non-threatening position. You don't want to do this, John said, his voice steady and deliberate, offering Mike one last chance to reconsider. But Mike's pride was already stoked, and he wasn't listening. Mike swung his fist, his right arm arcing in a wide, clumsy motion. To John, it felt like slow motion. He leaned to the right, easily dodging the blow as it whizzed past his shoulder. In the same fluid motion, he raised his left hand, guiding Mike's arm harmlessly past him and redirecting the force of the punch. Off balance, Mike stumbled forward, almost losing his footing. But instead of stopping, he charged again, this time flailing wildly with both arms. John took another step back, his eyes darting around the alley for a way to end the situation without escalating the violence. To his left, a large metal trash can leaned precariously against the wall. As Mike barreled toward him, John subtly nudged the can into his path with his foot. Mike's shin collided with the edge, sending him sprawling to one knee with a frustrated cry. Damn it! Mike yelled, trying to scramble to his feet. But before he could, John had already repositioned himself, maintaining a safe distance. Stop this, John said, his tone firmer now, a cold edge creeping into his words. You don't know what you're doing. But Mike's friends weren't ready to back down. Jake and Rob rushed forward, each armed with makeshift weapons scavenged from the alley, Jake with a short wooden plank, Rob with a shard of broken glass from an earlier altercation. Jake swung the plank downward, aiming for John's head. But John was ready. With quick reflexes, he grabbed a discarded metal pipe leaning against the wall and raised it to intercept the blow. The sharp clang of wood meeting metal echoed through the rain-drenched alley, the force of the collision jarring Jake's grip and causing him to drop the plank. Rob came at John from the side, brandishing the shard of glass high. But John pivoted smoothly, seizing Rob's wrist with his left hand and twisting it just enough to disarm him without causing serious harm. The shard clattered to the ground, shattering into smaller pieces. Rob cried out in pain, stumbling backward as John released him. Stop! John's voice roared above the rain, commanding and powerful, silencing the alley and reverberating off the brick walls. The young men froze in place, their heavy breathing the only sound besides the rain. The cocky bravado that had fueled their actions moments ago was now replaced with hesitation and fear. Mike climbed to his feet, his movements slow and hesitant. His eyes darted between John, his friends, and the rain-soaked ground. His clenched fists trembled, but he didn't move forward again. John stood tall, the pipe still in his hand, though he made no move to use it. He didn't need to. The situation was now firmly in his control, not through brute force, but through patience, experience, and a quiet strength that spoke louder than any act of violence could. Go home, John said, his voice calm yet commanding. Don't become the kind of people you'll regret being. His words lingered in the air, more powerful than any punch. The group exchanged uncertain glances, their heavy breaths filling the silence. Finally, a timid voice broke through from the back, Tyler's hesitant plea. Let's just go, Mike. It's not worth it. John kept his eyes fixed on them, standing tall with the metal pipe in his hand until the group of young men began to back away, step by step, before finally turning and walking off. The rain continued to pour, but the tension in the alley seemed to dissipate, leaving behind a quieter, lighter atmosphere. John relaxed his shoulders and lowered the pipe, letting it fall with a soft clang onto the wet ground. He bent down to pick up his backpack, then began walking slowly toward the end of the alley where the faint glow of streetlights awaited. In his mind, he knew this wasn't just another confrontation. It was a poignant reminder that patience and self-control are among the most powerful weapons one can wield. The rain continued to pour steadily, soaking the streets and alleys in a relentless downpour that masked the quiet tension lingering in the air. The bus, its headlights cutting through the hazy mist, stood idle at the alley's exit. The door eased open with a soft hiss, and from the shadows emerged a man with measured, deliberate steps. His silhouette was imposing against the dim streetlights, his presence cutting through the gloom like a beacon of quiet authority. Holding a small flashlight, Daniel moved with a practiced calm. He wasn't hurried, nor was he hesitant. There was a distinct confidence in his stride, the kind born not of arrogance, but of experience. His eyes scanned the narrow alleyway with the practiced gaze of someone who'd seen enough to recognize trouble before it fully took root. He took in the overturned trash can, the shards of broken glass glinting in the faint light, and the unmistakable tension still hanging in the air. John, Daniel called out, his voice low and steady, cutting through the rhythmic patter of rain. The beam of his flashlight swept across the alley, eventually settling on a familiar figure standing rigid and silent against the brick wall. John's posture remained tense, his shoulders squared and his gaze unwavering as though still braced for whatever might come next. The two men shared a brief moment of recognition, a silent exchange that spoke volumes without the need for words. Though their interactions had always been minimal, there was an unspoken understanding between them, forged by shared experiences on battlefields far from here. They were men who had seen conflict, who had endured the kind of trials that left indelible marks on a person's soul. Everything all right? Daniel asked, his flashlight's beam now steady on John's face. His tone was calm, but there was an underlying note of concern. John gave a slight nod, his hand instinctively tightening around the strap of his backpack as though anchoring himself in the present moment. It's all right now, he replied, his voice steady but reserved, offering no further details. There was no need to elaborate. Daniel could piece together the story from the remnants scattered around the alley. Daniel stepped closer, his gaze lingering on the shattered glass and the discarded metal pipe. He took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had seen countless similar situations unfold, moments of conflict that could easily spiral out of control if not carefully managed. Where are those kids? He asked, his voice dropping slightly, adopting a tone that was both pragmatic and protective. They're gone, John said, glancing toward the far end of the alley as if to confirm his own words. I don't think they'll be back. Daniel stood in thoughtful silence, his gaze shifting between John and the scattered remnants of the altercation. His expression was one of quiet contemplation, as though weighing the aftermath of the night's events. The rain continued to fall, creating rivulets of water that streamed down the alley's uneven surface, washing away traces of what had transpired. I'll call the police, Daniel said after a moment, his tone decisive. You don't have to stick around if you don't want to. You've done all you could to keep things under control. John hesitated, his gaze flickering to the broken glass on the ground before returning to Daniel. He knew the other man was right. Staying any longer would serve no purpose. Thank you, John said quietly, his words sincere. Daniel returned to the bus, stepping inside to activate the onboard radio. His voice crackled through the static as he contacted dispatch to request officers to check the area. When he stepped back out, the faint blue and red glow of distant police lights could already be seen reflecting off the wet pavement. "You kept your composure," Daniel said as he returned to John's side. There was a note of admiration in his voice, a rare acknowledgement from one veteran to another. "Not everyone can do that, especially in moments like this." John offered a faint smile, a subtle nod of appreciation. "I've learned that sometimes the strongest person is the one who knows when to stop." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "The battlefield teaches us a lot, doesn't it?" he said. "But the greatest lesson is about survival. Not just surviving the fights, but surviving the days that follow." John didn't respond with words, but the look in his eyes conveyed agreement. The two men stood in companionable silence for a moment longer, the rain falling steadily around them. There was a sense of shared understanding, a mutual respect that needed no further explanation. In the distance, the flash of police lights grew closer, illuminating the alley in brief bursts of color. John adjusted the strap of his backpack and prepared to leave, sensing that his presence was no longer necessary. "I'll let them handle the rest," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Thanks for stopping." Daniel placed a reassuring hand on John's shoulder, a simple gesture that carried profound respect. "Stay steady on your path, John," he said. "Don't let anyone shake you." John nodded once more before turning to walk away. His silhouette gradually faded into the rain, blending with the dim glow of the streetlights. Daniel watched him go, feeling a quiet sense of relief. The situation had been diffused, but more than that, he felt reassured knowing there were people like John in the world, people who understood how to balance strength with compassion. As the bus lights faded into the distance, the young men who had been hiding in the shadows of the alley finally emerged. Their movements were slow and deliberate, weighed down by the aftermath of what had transpired. The rain continued to fall, masking the unease etched across their faces. Jake and Tyler exchanged glances, their earlier bravado now completely gone. Even Mike, who had led the group with reckless confidence, stood in silence, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He refused to meet the gaze of his companions, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. What was that all about? Mike finally muttered, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "An old man and a bus driver, you think they're so great." His words hung in the air, hollow and meaningless. Tyler shook his head slowly. "We shouldn't have been here in the first place," he said quietly. "Let's just go." Jake nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah, we went too far. We're not done here," Mike snapped, but even he seemed unsure of his own words. He was grasping at control, desperate to hold onto the image of himself he'd cultivated. Yet deep down, he knew that control had slipped through his fingers. "Enough." The voice that cut through the rain was firm and unwavering. Emily stepped into the alley, her presence striking against the muted backdrop of the storm. Though her umbrella was nearly soaked through, she held it high, her posture straight and resolute. "Haven't you had enough?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rain falling around her. "What do you think you're proving with all of this?" The young men fell silent, unable to meet her gaze. Emily took another step closer, her eyes scanning each of them in turn. "Do you even know what he did for you?" she continued. "He didn't fight back. He didn't hurt you. He showed you what real strength looks like, restraint. And here you are, thinking you're proving something." Mike opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth of her statement cut deeper than any retort he could muster. Emily's tone softened slightly, though her gaze remained unwavering. "You still have a chance to change," she said. "Go home. Think about what you've done. Don't let tonight define who you are." As the rain continued to fall, creating ripples in the puddles that formed on the uneven pavement, John stood motionless at the edge of the alley. The night air was thick with moisture, and the faint scent of wet asphalt lingered in the breeze. His tall figure cast a long shadow under the dim glow of the streetlight, a silhouette of quiet resilience against the darkness that enveloped the street. Mike froze mid-step when he heard John's voice cut through the rain, low and steady but carrying an undeniable weight. The group of young men who had trailed behind him halted as well, their laughter fading into silence. The air grew tense, charged with unspoken emotions and an underlying current of uncertainty. "Mike," John called again, his tone unwavering. There was no anger in his voice, no trace of judgment, only a quiet insistence that demanded attention. Slowly, Mike turned to face him, his shoulders tense, his expression guarded. Their gazes met across the distance, and in that moment, something shifted. John wasn't looking at him with disdain or superiority, there was no condescension in his eyes. Instead, there was a firm understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity. It was a look that pierced through the layers of bravado Mike had built around himself, forcing him to confront a truth he had long buried. "You think you're untouchable," John began, his voice calm but resonating with authority. The rain softened to a drizzle, the droplets falling rhythmically as if marking the passage of time. "You think that by acting tough, by showing defiance, you're making yourself stronger. But you're not. You're just building walls around yourself. Walls that will trap you." Mike's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the rain. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a defensive vulnerability he couldn't hide. "You don't know what I've been through." John took a step forward, his movements deliberate but non-threatening. He stood tall, his presence commanding without being overbearing. "You're right. I don't know your story. But I know where the path you're on leads. I've seen too many young men like you take that road, thinking they're invincible, only to find themselves in places they never wanted to be. Places they can't come back from." Mike's gaze dropped to the wet pavement, his reflection distorted in the puddles. The weight of John's words settled heavily on his shoulders, pressing down on him like the rain-soaked air around them. He took a shaky breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a question filled with desperation, a plea for guidance he hadn't realized he needed. John stepped closer, closing the distance between them. His expression softened, a flicker of empathy crossing his features. "You don't have to change everything overnight," he said gently. "But you have to start somewhere. Stop trying to prove yourself by hurting others. Instead, do something better. Not for anyone else, but for yourself." The rain continued to fall, the gentle patter on the pavement providing a soothing backdrop to the conversation. Mike stood still, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. For the first time in a long while, he felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crack, letting in the faintest glimmer of light. Jake and Tyler, who had been watching from a distance, exchanged a glance but said nothing. They could sense the gravity of the moment, the unspoken understanding that something significant was happening. They remained silent, respecting the space John and Mike shared. After a long pause, Mike drew a deep breath, his shoulders slumping slightly as if shedding a heavy burden. "I don't know where to start," he murmured, his voice laced with uncertainty. John nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've already started," he said quietly. "By listening. By acknowledging that change is possible. That's the first step. From here, it's up to you." Mike lifted his gaze, meeting John's eyes once more. There was a flicker of awareness in his expression, a faint light of understanding that hadn't been there before. He gave a small, hesitant nod, the gesture subtle but significant. Without another word, Mike turned and began walking away, motioning for his friends to follow. Jake and Tyler hesitated for a moment before falling into step behind him, their footsteps echoing softly in the quiet alley. The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle, washing away the remnants of tension that had lingered in the air. John stood still, watching them disappear into the night. He didn't expect immediate change, but he knew a seed had been planted. He hoped that one day, Mike would look back on this moment not as a failure but as a turning point, a lesson that marked the beginning of something better. The rain finally stopped, leaving the air fresh and still. John bent down to pick up his backpack, his shoulders relaxing slightly as though shedding a heavy burden. He stepped out of the alley, merging into the warm glow of the streetlights that lined the quiet street. As he walked, his thoughts lingered on the encounter. He reflected on his own journey, the struggles he had faced and the lessons he had learned along the way. He had once been like Mike, defiant and lost, searching for a sense of purpose in a world that often seemed unforgiving. But he had found strength in restraint, in choosing compassion over aggression, in standing firm without resorting to violence. John's footsteps echoed softly on the wet pavement as he made his way home. The streets were deserted, the city bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and the faint shimmer of rain-soaked surfaces. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace, his mind at ease despite the night's events. When he reached his apartment building, he climbed the creaky wooden stairs to the second floor, each step resonating with a familiar rhythm. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the space enveloping him like a comforting embrace. His mother, Rose, sat in her favorite armchair by the window, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with quiet warmth and understanding. "You're home," she said softly, a gentle smile playing on her lips. John nodded, shrugging off his damp jacket and hanging it by the door. He approached her, setting his backpack down and taking the seat across from her. The aroma of tea filled the room, mingling with the faint scent of rain that clung to his clothes. Rose studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "Working late again?" she asked, her tone gentle but concerned. John smiled, lifting the waiting teacup to his lips. "Just a long day, Mom," he replied, the warmth of the tea spreading through him, chasing away the chill of the rain. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the quiet hum of the city outside providing a soothing backdrop. John's mind drifted back to the alley, to the young men he had encountered, and to the words he had spoken. There was a bit of trouble on the way home, he admitted, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, though tinged with weariness. "Some young guys causing a stir. But everything's fine now." Rose's brow furrowed slightly, her concern evident. But she didn't press for details. She knew her son well enough to understand that he always handled things in his own way, with quiet strength and unwavering resolve. "You did well," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "I've always known you'd handle things the right way." John's gaze softened, his smile widening slightly. Her faith in him was both humbling and comforting, a reminder of the values she had instilled in him from a young age. "I just hope they learn something," he said quietly. "I hope they'll look back on tonight and realize they don't have to live like that. Everyone can change if they truly want to." Rose nodded, her eyes filled with quiet wisdom. "And if anyone can plant the seed of change in them, it's you." John didn't respond, but her words lingered in his mind as he sipped his tea, letting the warmth spread through him. The night outside had grown still, the rain having dwindled to a faint drizzle. He gazed out the window, his thoughts drifting toward the distant lights of the city. He didn't know if Mike and his friends would truly change, but he held on to the hope that tonight might be the start of something different, a lesson they wouldn't forget. And with that hope, John leaned back in his chair, letting a rare sense of peace wash over him. He wasn't proud, nor did he have any regrets. He simply knew he had done what was right. And sometimes, that was enough.